Assassin's Creed 4 is a safe game. It is in every way the total opposite in its approach to video games as Assassin's Creed 3, which was an incredibly risky game. This is a pretty common tactic when you make something controversial like Assassin's Creed 3. If you want to win people back, then you need a crowd pleaser, and Black Flag is absolutely that crowd pleaser. Assassin's Creed 3 took a dark but often overlooked chapter of history and made it its entire focus with one of the only Native American game protagonists on the market. Black Flag takes one of the most popular historical periods in pop culture and tells a completely conventional story within that framework. It's a pirate game where you do pirate stuff in the shoes of an absolutely classic pirate guy. Black Flag isn't looking to subvert anything, and while that might be a significant step down narratively from what makes Assassin's Creed 3 one of my favourites, there is a plus side, which is that Black Flag is one of the most mechanically rich and well-designed games in the entire franchise. It is to this day a gold standard for open world design and still the best pirate game ever made. Crowd pleaser and safe can often be thrown around as insults, but if you do it well, it doesn't really matter, does it? I am in the crowd, and this time, I am quite pleased. The reason I can't fully commit to calling Assassin's Creed 3 my favourite game in the series is because of Assassin's Creed 4. The two games will forever be in competition for the top spot in my head, and there can't ever really be a winner because they are in parallel competition. Assassin's Creed 3's narrative is exceptionally strong, but mechanically it leaves a lot to be desired. Black Flag is a mechanical masterpiece, but narratively it's just fine. It's not bad, it's just middle-of-the-pack stuff, a completely traditional pirate story told in a completely traditional way. Also with some assassins in it, I guess. That lack of a subversive edge is kind of the point though. Assassin's Creed 3 put off a lot of people and the talk of creative stagnation was back with a vengeance. With dear old Des gone, there was a lot of people talking about how the franchise should really just end now. For the sake of the franchise, Black Flag had to be a win. If the franchise should have ended with 3 is not a conversation that I really care about having. It didn't end. It will never end. Let's just move on, shall we? Pirates is actually a very obvious place to take the series, considering that the naval combat was one of the best and most well-received features of Assassin's Creed 3. And there isn't a period of time more iconic to those big galleons and the golden age of piracy in the early 1700s. But more than some other groups, the pop culture idea of pirates is very separated from the historical truth of pirates. Don't get me wrong, the real-life pirates were absolutely larger-than-life figures. Blackbeard was a real guy that people actually called Blackbeard. But the pirate accent and the hook hands and the peg legs, that's all mostly a big exaggeration of a group of people who were, first and foremost, people. They were neither folk heroes or supervillains, and for Assassin's Creed that meant a lot of historical nuance that's left largely unexplored in greater pop culture. How well did they actually do that? Middle of the road, but we'll get to that in a bit. For now, it's time to take to the high seas, so without further ado, let's talk about Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. Assassin's Creed 4 is the story of Edward Kenway, father of Haytham Kenway and grandfather of Connor, so technically this game is a prequel, although only in the past, not in the present day, which is set after Assassin's Creed 3. That sounds more complicated than it is, and connections to Assassin's Creed 3 are pretty minimal. Desmond may be gone, but the modern day is still around in one of its weirder incarnations in the series. You are the data analyst, and you hire Abstergo Entertainment working on their next big game project using the Animus technology, which is going to be about pirates. So, basically, you're playing as the designer of Assassin's Creed 4. If you thought Liberation was getting meta, then get ready to batten down the hatches. Abstergo secured Desmond's body after his death, which is how you have access to Edward's memories, and just like you'd expect, Abstergo has some alternate objectives to simple entertainment and digging around in Edward's life. But we'll leave it there for now. Unlike with the Desmond saga, where Desmond's story is positioned narratively as the real story of the game, the modern day element of Assassin's Creed 4 is much more of a side story. It's not even introduced as a concept until about half an hour into the game. You start in the Animus, with Edward already well into his pirate career. This is the first of many things that's a direct response to criticisms of Assassin's Creed 3. Assassin's Creed 3 takes its sweet time to get going, not until at least a third of the way through have you actually reached the box art point of the game. So Black Flag wastes no time at all getting you into the thick of it. Edward's story is a bit different to the previous games, however, in that he doesn't actually become an assassin until almost the end of the game. Sequence 11 of 12 is when he officially joins up. The game actually opens with Edward killing an assassin. For most of the game, he's just a pirate in a stolen costume. For some, this prompts the age-old "is this even an Assassin's Creed game?" debate, but I don't think that's much of an issue. The game still hits a lot of the usual Assassin's Creed beats, it just so happens that Edward doesn't call himself an assassin. You're still running around in a hood stabbing Templars. The game borrows a strategy from Assassin's Creed 3, introducing you to all of the Templars in the opening sequence. The assassin Edward killed, Duncan Walpole, was actually a traitor planning to join the Templars, so Edward assumes his identity to try and make some money out of the opportunity. Edward never intended on getting wrapped up in all the secret conspiracies, but he knows an opportunity when he sees one. Edward belongs to a very classic trope, especially in pirate stories, the thief with a heart of gold. However, unlike some other versions of this trope, it takes a very long time before Edward actually embraces that heart of gold. The majority of the game has him doing the opposite, sliding more and more into nihilism and apathy. His actions in the first act of the game have consequences that are still being felt by the end of the game. He helps the Templars a great deal by giving them Walpole's maps of all the assassin hideouts in the region, and even killing many more assassins when they try and attack the Templars. The Templars' chats about world domination don't faze him at all. What really pisses him off is when they only give him 1,000 rial for his work. They're looking for something in the Caribbean called the Observatory, another precursor site that apparently functions like that thing Batman makes in The Dark Knight, the ultimate spy device. And Edward decides he's going to steal it out from under them to make his fortune. That's the primary driver of the rest of the narrative. In classic pirate fashion, it's a treasure hunt. His treachery is quickly found out and he's sent away aboard a slave ship which he manages to escape shockingly easily and makes off with a galleon alongside fellow prisoner Adewale. And this is the point where the true breadth of Black Flag properly opens up.
By God, she took some knocks, didn't she? I think I'll keep her.
All hands aft, lads! I'm taking this one home!
Black Flag was the first game in the series made for the Xbox One and PS4. It technically also came out on the previous generations at the same time, given that it came out in that wonderful transitional period between generations, but it was clearly designed with the new generations in mind. Beyond just being a very pretty game, Black Flag is expansive in a way the previous technological limitations would have made very difficult. In Assassin's Creed 3, the naval missions are completely distinct from the base game. You access them from a menu for the most part, and they feel separate. In Black Flag, you can go from a full naval engagement to running around on an island completely seamlessly in a matter of moments. The way the game can flip between these two entirely different feeling games with completely different scales is still impressive to this day. It's also another element of the game that prompts the "is this even Assassin's Creed" debate. You spend at least half the game on the Jackdaw, possibly more. It's as much a main character of the game as Edward himself, and adds a fourth pillar to the 3 pillars that previously defined the core gameplay of the series: stealth, combat, exploration, and now piracy. Although it may be more accurate to say that the naval gameplay incorporates those 3 pillars all on its own, because yes, the game does include naval stealth, and it's as silly as that sounds. I'm personally of the school of thought that Assassin's Creed should adapt its gameplay to its setting, not the other way around, and Black Flag provides the perfect example of why. Because being a pirate is fun as hell in Black Flag. The already fun naval combat of 3 is enhanced to perfection in Black Flag, making it a challenge of positioning and endurance. Each direction is tied to a different weapon for different effects. It's honestly more mechanically engaging than the actual on-foot combat, which is still pretty much the exact same level of style over substance combat that's been with the series since Assassin's Creed 1. But it's not the gameplay mechanics alone that make Black Flag's sandbox so impressive, it's the way that the sandbox is structured. Black Flag's open world is built with purpose. Everything you do in the game, no matter how small, is designed with player satisfaction in mind. Every system feeds into every other system in a satisfying loop. When you first enter the open world, it's a sea of question marks. This is the exploration phase. Under each question mark is an explorable location. It could be a desert island, or a plantation, or possibly a Mayan ruin, but each location will have lots of side activities to do there. You don't need to hunt very hard for all the collectibles. In fact, you can usually run around and get them all in about 5 minutes, at which point the location will turn to a satisfying gold on the map, signifying its completion. This is a core part of the distraction loop. It's very easy to land on an island, gather up all the goodies to find stand there and keep sailing forward. And the same is applied to the actual piracy. Your primary objective in raiding other ships is upgrade materials for the Jackdaw, and with your spyglass you can quickly identify all of the resources that a ship is carrying. So as you're sailing to your actual objective, you might spot a Spanish galleon with 100 metal and take a quick detour to put those resources in better hands. This is how the piracy in the game is set up. It's designed to be done opportunistically as you're doing other things. Unlike most games, the difficulty curve of the game is inverted. It becomes easier as you go along because the upgrades to the Jackdaw are significant. By the end of the tree, with enough resources invested, you're easily the most dangerous ship in the Caribbean. But being overpowered has always been the appeal of Assassin's Creed combat. They're not designed to be difficult as much as they're designed to be fun, and Black Flag is very fun. It's the same cozy game design that made Brotherhood so engaging, just taken to the high seas. Instead of renovating Rome, you're painting the Caribbean gold and beefing up the Jackdaw. Edward can also be upgraded in the same way. The hunting has actually been severely simplified from 3, but so has the crafting system, which was very cryptic in 3. Now it's a simple exchange. Kill 2 sharks, upgrade your health. A 1-for-1 deal that makes hunting feel more mechanically rewarding than it did in 3. It also makes PETA mad at you for glorifying whaling, but those guys get mad at everything. The term checklisting is often thrown around these days as an insult against Ubisoft's style of open world design, and Black Flag along with Far Cry 3 are really where Ubisoft zeroed in on this checklisting approach to their open worlds. I think throwing the term around disparagingly ignores that checklisting, if done well, can be an immensely satisfying game experience. Like all of the previous games, Black Flag provides a tremendous sense of time and place in its atmospheric details. The turquoise blue seas, or the creaking of the ships, the sea shanties that your crew will burst into as you sail. Black Flag is just a wonderful world to spend time in, and the checklist approach provides a structure and a drip feed of constant rewards for just spending time in the world. The 3 major settlements on the map are also very distinct from one another, which gives the game a greater sense of variety than 3, where Boston and New York look basically exactly the same. There's the Spanish settlement of Havana, the most built-up location in the game, with the painted stone walls and grand churches. There's the British settlement of Kingston, which taps into the Assassin's Creed 3 aesthetic of wooden buildings and houses. And then finally there's the Pirate Republic of Nassau, which is more of a shantytown than an actual settlement, tapping into that classic pirate colony aesthetic. Another critique of Assassin's Creed 3 was the linear structure of its level design, and it's true that in a lot of the story missions in Assassin's Creed 3 there's really only one way you can actually go about doing things. Black Flag makes a deliberate pivot away from that design as much as it can, giving you an objective and letting you go about that objective in whichever way you see fit outside of a couple scripted story moments. The game makes its intentions clear early in the story when it gives you an objective marker on the other side of the map, way beyond where you've likely been so far. It's an invitation to get distracted with the many different activities to do along the way. A primary issue with checklisting can be how repetitive it is, and Black Flag solves this by making a bunch of different kinds of locations and dispersing them equally around the map. Naval forts are a nautical challenge, plantations are a stealth challenge, underwater dives are an exploration challenge. You are going to end up doing a lot of similar locations, but it's unlikely you'll be doing a bunch of similar locations at the same time, which makes it feel a lot less repetitive. There is some amount of mechanical escalation to the naval combat. The map is completely open from the beginning, but it's separated by difficulty, getting more difficult as you head south, with bigger ships and bigger corresponding rewards. But the biggest and baddest ships are cordoned off at the edges of the map to serve as endgame optional bosses for when you're at the peak of your power. All of this is built to create the ultimate pirate fantasy experience, which is where we intersect with a spectre that continues to loom large over the series. Historical accuracy versus authenticity. Not much of the piracy you do in Black Flag is really all that historically accurate. The big naval fights and dramatic boarding swaying from the rigging is pure Hollywood fiction. In reality, most piracy was done without firing a single shot, via trickery and bluffs. Getting into big flashy fights was not desirable for many very mundane economic reasons, like that fixing cannon holes in pirate ships is quite expensive. The game also very heavily sideskirts the actual politics of a pirate ship, which is to say that unlike a ship with the Royal Navy where a captain has total authority, a pirate ship was run completely democratically. Every action was done on a vote. A ship would only be raided if the majority decided. This does happen once in-game, but it would be a nightmare to do this every time you wanted to raid a ship, so that's a pretty natural cut. You also exclusively raid military ships, which in reality is the opposite of what any pirate would want to do if they can help it. They primarily raided merchant vessels that were less defended, less likely to fight back, and much less likely to hang you for treason. But the game doesn't want you to feel like a villain. You're a puckish rogue, so attacking the British or Spanish empires always feels like punching up instead of down. There is some other anachronisms that slip in there too, like the side activity where you chase down buried treasure with X marking the spot, which obviously pirates didn't actually do because it's a terrible way to keep your treasure safe. But it is absolutely a part of the pirate fantasy. This is the fine line to walk between the historical authenticity that the series prides itself on, and the reality of making a fun video game. There are certain places where you just have to meet your audience where they're at. There are things people will expect from a pirate game and will be upset if they don't find them in there. I think that Black Flag actually does a great job of threading that line, and it's primarily because of their portrayal of the pirates themselves, as people, not as caricatures.
Captain Thatch, as I live and breathe. What is this magnificent muzzle you cultivate?
Why fly a black flag when a black beard will do?
The golden age of piracy was not very long, about 10 years, and in researching it, it's kind of amazing that more stories don't tap into the actual history of the era instead of the Hollywood version of the era. It's got such a clear narrative within it already. For just a brief period of time, a whole bunch of economic, political, and geographical factors created a window where pirates became their own miniature civilization. A bunch of guys who, if you had written them, would be accused of being too cliché, but they were real and they existed, all working together to try and build something that was absolutely doomed to fail. And the man who eventually brought the Enterprise to an end, Woodes Rogers, was pretty much a Bond villain in the making. It's not too much of an issue that Edward doesn't join the Assassins until the end of the game because the Flying Gang and their burgeoning pirate republic fit neatly into the same ideology of the Assassins, but with a hollow edge. Life aboard a vessel in the British or Spanish Empire sucked. It sucked a lot. Ships were ruled with an authoritarian hand and wages were awful to compensate. A lot of sailors weren't even paid at all, they were conscripts. These are the economic factors that led to the rise of piracy, why men like Ben Hornigold and Ed Thatch abandoned king and country to make it on their own. Greed was a factor, but it wasn't the only factor. The British Empire was a bit evil? I hope that's not a hot take. The life of a pirate living in the Bahamas on a commune of like-minded individuals all looking for a better lot in life has a hell of a lot more appeal than continuing to serve an empire that doesn't care if you live or die, ruled by a king who, at the time, wasn't even British. Nassau wasn't just a haven for thieves and rogues, it was a genuine attempt at building a better society where men were equal and free. The only issue is that it was still a society completely built on stealing from others. It was never going to last. And along with radical freedom comes some very different ideas of what that freedom means. The idealists like Ben Hornigold had their opposition in the likes of Charles Vane, who mostly just wanted to fuck shit up and make money. The game places Edward right in the centre of it all as one of the founders of Nassau. It's kind of insane to imagine that he could be here, not even hiding who he is or being all that clandestine, but somehow he wouldn't end up in the history books alongside Thatch and Hornigold. But that's fine, it's not our real history anyway. Edward contains within him the same hypocrisy as Nassau as a whole, in that he speaks a bunch of personal liberty and freedom while making a career out of robbery and murder. It's not really a selfless community, it's a community where everyone is selfish together and just don't judge each other for it. The game certainly romanticizes pirates and the pirate life a bit to make this work, mostly by cutting the vast majority of their interactions with women, which were historically not ideal. As an audience, you're already predisposed to root for the pirates because of a lifetime of pirate media. They're the cool, sexy bad boys of the sea, unlike those stuffy redcoats. The game uses that impulse against you by demonstrating in meticulous detail all the flaws with the pirate republic and why it was always doomed to fail. You can't build a stable republic with mad dogs like Charles Vane and Calico Jack. You can't fight the entire British Navy no matter how many cannons you set up. You can't build a society entirely made for personal pleasure and entertainment. Eventually, you need someone to grow the crops and build the taverns, and these are not men built for farm work. The entire Enterprise was short-sighted, just like Edward's personal quest to find the observatory. It'll all work out, trust me. Edward spends the vast majority of the game being a selfish asshole who demonstrably doesn't care about anyone but himself. But he's also plucky and charismatic, so it's fine, right? You can trust him to do the right thing, can't you?
I grow tired of chasing these fantasies of yours, Edward. As does the crew.
Hang in there, man. We're getting close.
Edward being a dick for most of the story isn't actually my problem with Edward. I think that's fine. I think Edward is fine, a completely serviceable protagonist. The issue is that for the story and the era, he is the obvious choice of protagonist, the safe choice, a white bread disgruntled with his lot in life. It's that genericness that allows him to integrate so effortlessly with the flying gang, but also that makes the entire story feel more obvious. While most pirate media doesn't tackle the real history like Black Flag does, they do tackle the same themes. This greed versus idealism thing is like the core pillar of pirate media, or really any media that deals with organised crime. Black Flag does it well, but I've seen it before. You pretty much know exactly how Black Flag is going to end from the very beginning, and not just because it's a prequel. He's going to keep on his greed-driven path, losing all of his friends and loved ones along the way because of his obsession, but at his lowest point he'll finally realise it and turn it all around, making up for all his past wrongs. And that's exactly how it goes down beat for beat. That's not bad, all the emotional beats land as intended, it's just fine. It's not subversive like Connor's story was, and it doesn't challenge you as a player in any way. Black Flag is, after all, a crowd pleaser. Not every player wants to be challenged by a narrative. I don't always want to be either. But Black Flag has within it several opportunities to tell that more subversive story and just refuses to. The game has a habit of dangling potentially interesting protagonists in front of you just to say, nah, but Edward though. One of the best side activities in the game is the Templar hunts, where you hunt down some of the multiplayer avatars to steal a special key that will unlock some cool armour, a series staple at this point. But each hunt is actually a full-on quest chain, where you get to know one of the local assassin bureau leaders. All of these assassins are actual characters, not just placeholder NPCs, and each of them are designed and written in such a way that they easily could be the protagonist of their own Assassin's Creed game, just having a quick intersection with Edward's story, like the Taino assassin Opia looking to avenge her people, or the Maroon assassin Antul balancing between his commitment to the free slaves and the Assassin Guild. These would have offered completely different and untold perspectives on the era, but instead we're following the story that everyone would expect to follow, the one we've seen before. In some ways they do feed into Edward's character. Edward isn't a racist, but he is at best ambivalent on the racial issues of the time. He doesn't participate in slavery, but he's in no real rush to stop it either, an attitude that wasn't uncommon amongst pirates of the era. The two main candidates for more interesting protagonists are also Edward's two closest friends in the game. His quartermaster Adewale and young James Kidd, later revealed to be one of the most famous female pirates, Mary Read.
Ready?
Your name's not James, is it?
Not most days. Come on.
Adewale is such an obvious pick as protagonist that he actually does get the player one spot in Black Flag's big DLC expansion. But here in the base game, he is the primary lens by which the game tackles the issues of racism and slavery, which, to be fair to them, is pretty cool to include at all, considering that the vast majority of pirate stories just ignore slavery entirely, despite it making up pretty much the entire economy of the West Indies during the era. He was born into slavery in Trinidad, making him a man with no homeland, or at least not one he considers an actual home. In every way, he's just as capable as Edward, and he could easily be captain of the Jackdaw, but for one issue. He's the wrong colour.
Did it rub you wrong when I took this brig as mine own?
It was the sort of rub I have learned to endure, sailing among faces of such fairness.
It's true. Most of these men wouldn't accept you as a captain.
Even Edward's friends at Nassau treat him with some level of suspicion and ridicule. Calico Jack threatens to sell him back into slavery at one point. Adewale lives in a whole different reality to Edward, one where peace is never an option and piracy is his only real shot at freedom. And even there, he's tolerated, not accepted. Mary Read likewise lives in a different reality to Edward, a woman trapped in a man's world. She has skills equal to, or in many cases superior to her fellow pirates, but if any of them knew her true identity, then her power and influence would go out the window. She's a woman of fierce convictions and probably the most morally good character in the whole game, but to fight for those convictions she has to live a lie. This difference in reality is what draws both characters to the assassins, Mary before the game begins and Ade as the story unfolds. The assassins, as it did for Connor or Aveline, offer a place where these social boundaries and expectations are dropped, and both are free to live as their authentic selves and fight to make that world a reality for everyone. That, to me, is a much stronger hook than what eventually draws Edward to the assassins, which is guilt. Either character would have made a much more interesting protagonist for the game, both offer a radically different perspective on the era than the one we're used to, and both are strong enough characters to carry a game on their shoulders. But there would be one large problem with that, one that the game, in its own way, even points out. Both characters would be too hard to market. Abstergo Entertainment is a story element carried over from Liberation, only this time the framing is different. Liberation was the end product, you were playing the edited propaganda version of the story. Black Flag mixes up the order of things, you're playing through the real history and you see the edited version later. Unfortunately, this mix-up in presentation also fundamentally changes the feeling of the game and the way these edits come across. Instead of coming across as an interesting commentary on how history has changed to fit the storyteller's agenda, it more comes across as Ubisoft giving themselves a big pat on the back for totally not doing that. As part of the modern day story, you end up with the ability to hack all of the computers in the building, unlocking various files and secrets. Some of the best, and definitely the most entertaining, are market evaluation presentations on the previous Assassin's Creed protagonists. The presenter mispronounces their names and slanders them, totally misinterpreting their stories and personalities to present Altair as a radical and incoherent terrorist, and Enzio as a creepy predatory pervert. The one on Connor is most interesting though, because it pretty much block quotes the exact criticisms people actually made about Connor. He's too boring, angry and naive to be a likeable leading role, and the Mohawk culture and language are too alienating to general audiences. Rather than coming across as a fun little joke, this one feels more like Ubisoft reaching through the screen and showing me how cool and brave they are for doing all that stuff despite the risk.
Unfortunately, our researchers found this young man's story deeply problematic as well. For one, the omnipresence of the Mohawk culture lacks the balance necessary to tell the true story of America. And secondly, the Mohawk language would certainly be an issue for most of our audience. We therefore feel that although Ratana Tenkon's early life would be of some interest to our more educated viewers, it's unlikely that his story would appeal on a broader scale, being too foreign, as it were, to normal audiences. Our team recommends we pass on this property.
I agree, Ubisoft, it is cool that you did that despite the obvious risks. I just think it's a bit weird to brag about that in a game where you're now doing the exact opposite. Something that comes up a couple times in the game is that Abstergo are planning to dub over Edward's Welsh accent with an English James Bond type voice, in effort to make Edward seem a little more subversive because he is in fact Welsh. So, score one for you, Wales, but I'm not giving this one to Ubisoft because I'm pretty sure that most Americans can't tell the difference anyway. That is, unless they sound like Black Bart does in this game, but even then I have my doubts. That was awful, I'm sorry, Wales. The Animus database this time around is written by Abstergo employees and is full of editor's notes and people discussing things that will need to be changed or cut for better market appeal. The entry for Mary Read has your boss voicing concerns about if a cross-dressing character will play for general audiences, and I think in that case the concern is absolutely valid, unfortunately. I'm not sure even today you could get away with a game where cross-dressing is a core mechanic and narrative element, even though Mary Read was real and by all accounts the cross-dressing is historically accurate. I don't think Ubisoft is wrong to doubt the marketability of Adewale or Mary Read versus a safe, sure thing like Edward. I just think it's a bit rich to brag about doing the brave thing in the game where you're now doing the safe thing instead. Ade and Mary will never be the marketable heroes if nobody ever tells their stories. This meta aspect of Black Flag, that you are in effect working at Ubisoft within a game made by Ubisoft, is just very weird. The office is based in Montreal, just like Ubisoft Montreal, and it's all designed to evoke that modern, trendy, hip office culture that game studios are all trying to capture. They are, very directly, making themselves the villain while at the same time showing how much better they are than the villain, which is themselves? Considering everything we now know about the internals of Ubisoft and how the director of this game, Arshraf Ismail, was one of the men named and eventually fired in the 2020 reports, this weird conflicting self-portrayal of Ubisoft actually rings kind of genuine. Ubisoft is a company full of talented, ambitious and dedicated people working to try and make good games. Ubisoft is also owned and operated by a pack of rats. Maybe they're not trying to secretly rule the world, but they absolutely don't have their employees' best interests at heart, and I wouldn't put it past them to have a secret prison dungeon in the basement. Was that an intentional reading of the game? Almost certainly not, but it is interesting that Ubisoft released a game where its low-level employees are the pawns and victims of an evil upper management who doesn't care about them at all. It's a choice. And it's really the primary substance of the modern day this time. The actual plot is about John from IT manipulating you into doing his dirty work, hacking the servers and passing along the information to the familiar-looking couriers outside. Without a speaking protagonist, your connection to the modern day story is kind of nebulous. Not to mention you walk at frustratingly slow human speeds, which makes every sequence in the modern day absolutely drag. John from IT is also the main tie between the past storyline and the present day, because it turns out he has an agenda beyond just helping the assassins. The main villain of Black Flag, or at least the guy who should be the main villain but for some reason technically isn't, is Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts, the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, and also in this game a sage. What that actually means is unclear for most of the game, but by the end it's apparent that he's a reincarnation of Juno's husband Aita, the guy who we saw her mercy killing back in Assassin's Creed 3. This is one little sci-fi twist that I actually quite like, more interesting than any of the magic artifacts anyway, because Black Bart is one of the best characters in the game. He's positioned as a dark reflection of Edward, the pirate Edward is destined to become if he doesn't change his ways. Like Edward, he refuses to pick a side in the Assassin-Templar conflict, preferring to do everything on his own. The reason everyone is after him is that only a sage knows where to find the observatory. He was born with memories of an ancient time and place that drive most sages a little bit loopy. But Roberts is just completely unwilling to be a MacGuffin and is constantly escaping and causing mischief. He's a captive of the Templars when you first meet him, but he's no victim, just like when you try to rescue him from a slaver and it turns out that he's actually that slaver's top employee. Roberts is a bad dude. A merry life and a short one goes his motto, an affirmation to not give a crap about anything and just live in the way that benefits you the most personally. Edward only starts working with Roberts deep into his own nihilistic spiral. Historically, things did not go well for the Nassau pirates, and as the game goes along, each of Edward's friends are picked off one by one. Blackbeard tries to retire, but the Royal Navy have other ideas. Charles Vane gets stranded on an island and completely loses his mind. Ben Hornigold joins the Templars and Edward has to kill him himself. With nothing left to go back to, Edward focuses all of his attention on finding the observatory, and that means working with a bastard like Roberts. Something that starts to drive a serious wedge in his friendship with former slave Adewale. And shock surprise, once you make it to the observatory, Roberts betrays Edward and leaves him to die. He only survives, as he does many times, through dumb luck. There's a frustrating realism to Edward's story. There are countless times where he absolutely should die, but doesn't thanks to either dumb luck or, more often, second chances that he really doesn't deserve. Where Mary or Adewale will bail him out of a bad situation just because they're friends, even when Edward has never really proven to them that he would actually return the favour. They both see more in Edward, both believe that a good man lies buried within him, and there was a time once when Edward's intentions for coming to sea were noble, to support his wife and get the money required to start a family. But those noble intentions warped into obsession and resentment over the years. Roberts gets Edward thrown into a Jamaican prison, where once again he's spared from the gallows by luck and the second chance he doesn't deserve. Mary and her friend Anne Bonny, another famous female pirate, also get caught around the same time, and Mary's assassin mentor comes to rescue them, who on a whim decides to free Edward as well. It's only here after years and years of making stupid mistakes and managing to keep getting away with it that Edward has to face a genuine consequence. Mary and Anne manage to stay their own executions by pleading their bellies, which is to say by being pregnant. But a 1700s Jamaican prison is not exactly a sanitary environment to have a baby, and Mary dies of illness or complications while trying to escape. There's no way Edward can justify this one. She didn't go down fighting like Blackbeard, she didn't betray Edward like Ben or Charles or the mutinous Calico Jack. This is just completely unfair. Mary was a good person, a person who fought for justice and who stuck her neck out for Edward on several occasions when he absolutely didn't deserve it. She deserves to live so much more than Edward does. But that's just life, isn't it? Life isn't governed by a moral compass. Good people die and bad people live based purely on a bad hand.
Don't die on my account. Go.
This is such a pain in the ass. Damn it. You should have been the one to outlast me.
I've done my part. Will you?
But the one saving grace is that it's never too late to change. You can turn a life of good fortune and undeserved second chances into something meaningful. That's what Adewale did. While Edward was stuck in prison, he gave up the pirate life and joined the assassins. And he strongly encourages Edward to do the same. It's a better alternative to drinking his sorrows away alone in a bar at any rate. I understand why some people love this game's story. It's for moments like this, moments that just really work. They don't push boundaries or break the mold in any way. It's a fairly typical story beat for a character like Edward. But the mold exists for a reason. It works, it gets the job done, and I enjoy a redemption arc as much as the next person. It's the last run of missions where the structure starts to get a little bit ropey. When finally joining the assassins, there are 3 men who must die, 3 monsters of Edward's own making that he has to fix. Woods Rogers, Black Bart, and Lorenzo Torres, the Templar Grand Master. Of the 3, Torres is by far the least interesting. In fact, he's one of the most bland Grandmasters in the series, up there with Uncle Bad Guy from Revelations. Woodes Rogers is more interesting, but actually kind of dulled down from the real historical Woodes Rogers, who has an extremely storied career, which we know a lot about since he published his own journals. Giving us one of the best primary sources of the era, he was one of the few men to circumnavigate the globe, which is when he got his Bond villain scar in battle after taking a musket ball to the face and surviving. The man had a storied life that's only hinted at in this game. By far the most compelling, though, is Black Bart, because of how much personal history he has with Edward by this point in the story. The game is obviously building up to a final confrontation with Roberts, but then, he's the second man on the list you take down, and the actual final confrontation is with Torres in the observatory. Pretty much just because he's the big bad Templar. It feels like it's out of order. Torres should be the first one you kill. For the final sequences, Adewale is replaced as quartermaster by Anne Bonny, who historically does disappear from the history books after she and Mary's incarceration. And thematically that feels right. Adewale has moved beyond Edward into his own story, and now it's the last of the Nassau pirates, bringing the golden age of piracy to a close, generally considered to be the death of Black Bart. And also Lorenzo Torres, I guess. It's not necessarily a bad choice to end on Torres, it just feels like the wrong choice. It's not the confrontation that the game was obviously building up to. Regardless, the modern-day climax is much stranger. John from IT tricks you into unleashing Juno in the Abstergo server room, where she appears before you as a ghost in the machine. Apparently, the plan was for her to take over your body and wear you as a skin suit, but she's not strong enough for that to happen yet, and John from IT is very mad about this. And as a normal and rational data analyst, your reaction to all of this is to dutifully get back to work. It's kind of insane. Like, I think John from IT just tried to kill me and he's still in the building and has access to all of the security systems. I'm most certainly in grave danger. But I do have that quota to meet. Lo and behold, the next time you wake up, John from IT is standing over you trying to kill you. Who could have seen this coming? He reveals that, like Roberts, he's also a sage with the same face, same eyes, and for some reason the same mustache, which does not play as well in the 21st century. So I guess technically the final confrontation is with Roberts after all, on a technicality. Although it is insane that nobody in the building also researching Edward noticed that John from IT looks exactly like Roberts. It's fine, he gets gunned down by Abstergo security, and after all that fun, that's right, it's back to work for you. Thankfully, Black Flag understands this is Edward's story and not the data analyst, so we return to the Animus for an epilogue. Along with salvaging his morality, Edward also sends a letter home, making a genuine effort to repair things with his estranged wife. As it turns out, it's too late for that. She's dead. But there is something just as important on the way, a daughter who he never knew existed. It's a happier ending than maybe a scoundrel like Edward really deserves, but he has a chance now to grow up and be the man of noble intentions that Mary thought he was. The man he wasn't when he left his wife all those years ago. Were any of his other friends more or less deserving of this ending? Maybe. Realistically, it could have been any of them if not for luck and circumstance. So even if he doesn't quite deserve it, he owes it to those who are gone to live that life as best he can. And besides, it's not exactly all sunshine and rainbows. The prequelness of the story slips back in at the end, with Edward taking his son to the Royal Opera House, the same one Hatham would later return to 20 years later to kill an assassin mentor himself. A complicated family if ever there was one. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Black Flag saved the Assassin's Creed franchise and propped it up for the next decade. If Black Flag had flopped, I don't think the franchise would have survived. So as much as I can admonish them for taking the safest choices at every opportunity, I understand why they did, and I can't exactly critique it too harshly because clearly it worked. It's just a little bit rude of them then to tease me so harshly with a version of Assassin's Creed 4 which could have been so much more daring and interesting.
Yeah, let me so but I lie.
Freedom Cry is the big DLC expansion for Black Flag, set about 15 years after the events of the base game, with Adewale well into his career as an assassin. It's such a big DLC that on some platforms they even released it as its own standalone game. It takes all of the excellent mechanics and structure of Black Flag's open world, compresses them a little, and adds a story with some serious heft and gravitas to it. And the result is some of the best stuff in the entire Black Flag experience. There is another DLC for Black Flag, a much more forgotten one because it was a PlayStation exclusive. A short one of missions starring Aveline helping a runaway slave at Connor's request. I can't play it because I'm a poor Xbox boy, but I did watch a playthrough and it's short. Poor Aveline can't ever get a full story. I'm not sure Freedom Cry is big enough to justify a solo release. To me it definitely feels more DLC sized, but that's not to say it doesn't represent a high level of polish, and it wouldn't take much to expand it to, if not a full-length game, then at least a worthy little spin-off. On the hunt for a Templar artifact, Adewale ends up shipwrecked on the coast of Port-au-Prince, Saint-Dominique, or modern-day Haiti, which, if you know anything about Haitian history, you may immediately recognise as a pretty significant place for a former slave to end up because Haiti was the slave capital of the Caribbean. It's estimated that Haiti alone made up about a third of all slavery in the Caribbean during the era, and the conditions were especially grim. And especially grim for the treatment of slaves means shit was really, really bad. There's not a less safe place in the world that a man like Adewale could have ended up. Freedom Cry, despite being shorter, explores slavery in much greater detail than Liberation ever did. I think primarily because unlike Aveline, Adewale has no escape from it. His body literally marks him as a slave, both the shackle scars around his wrists and the brand on his chest that marks him as property. He can't blend into polite society like Aveline can, he will always be on the run. Yet despite it all, Adewale is surprisingly affable and personable. He's lived a life harder than most people can even imagine, but he's somehow maintained optimism that the world can be better. That's why he slots so naturally into the player 1 spot. He's almost folk heroish in his defiance and willpower. During his time in Haiti, he ends up working alongside the Maroons, runaway slaves fighting to start a rebellion against the French government, which is where the biggest mechanical difference comes from the base game. The same resources for upgrading your ship still apply, but Adewale cares about a much more important resource: people. The institution of slavery completely surrounds you in Freedom Cry. Every corner you turn you'll see a slave auction, or people locked in cages, or people being unjustly punished. The cruelty is so common that it's mundane, most people just walk right past it. But Adewale is not most people. Liberating slaves is the core objective of the DLC. As you free more people, you'll also unlock some gameplay rewards to keep up with the drip-feed rewards of the base game, but that's really just a bonus. I don't know if anyone could play this and not feel the overwhelming desire to fuck up some slave drivers with a machete. It can be difficult to even comprehend the cruelty of slavery. Freedom Cry doesn't shy away from harsh truths, and even then it's presenting a tame version of the practice compared to reality. Rage is absolutely the intended emotion that the game is trying to provoke, because balancing that rage with reality is both a core game mechanic and the centre of the plot. I think there's a really interesting contrast in the way that Edward and Adewale see a plantation. A plantation in the base game is a treasure trove. Sneak in, find the guy with the key, grab it, and loot the storehouse. Edward could not give less of a shit about the slaves working those fields or what happens to them after he leaves. In Freedom Cry, Adewale could not give less of a shit about that warehouse. The true value on a plantation are the people used and exploited on it. But you have to be extremely careful, much more careful than Edward needs to be, because if you get caught, the overseers don't just start attacking you. You're a slave, you're starting a slave revolt. So it's time to start cutting down all the slaves, whether they're fighting back or not. If Edward fails the stealth, he loses out on some extra money. If Adewale fails it, he loses people. That's a much more mechanically and emotionally cruel punishment, but it drives home exactly what the DLC is trying to enforce. The consequences of resisting slavery are fundamentally unfair. The black population of Haiti vastly outnumbered the white population. This was something that every slaver was intensely aware of. If every slave rebelled at once, they'd be screwed, so to keep that from happening, punishment for revolt has to be harsh, swift, and overwhelming. If you try to stand against it, you're not just hurting yourself, you're putting everyone around you at great risk as well. The reality that fighting against slavery will result in the deaths of completely innocent people because of your actions is a harsh truth to swallow, one that is deliberately designed to break your fighting spirit. Freedom Cry only has a couple major characters aside from Adewale: Augustine, the head of the local Maroons, and Bastien Joseph, a free woman who keeps herself that way by running the city's brothel. Each of them sit on either side of Adewale's shoulders, a voice of caution and a voice of action. Augustine refuses to sit still. In fact, he joins Adewale on his new ship as quartermaster and trainee for the day that he'll need to captain it himself. Bastien prefers a subtler approach because the consequences of too much violent action are, to her, a price that's too high to pay. She prefers trying to manipulate the rich and powerful to her cause. As an assassin, Adewale is capable of using both approaches, but the dark, depressing truth is that neither approach really works. Haiti is famously the site of the most successful slave revolution in history, but that's not destined to happen for another 70 years. For now, it doesn't matter how many slaves you free, you can't end slavery. There will always be more people brought in. The economy must be maintained at any cost. It's willfully ignorant to imagine that the French governor won't retaliate to the amount of slaves Adewale has already freed, but it's so often that cruelty of such a scale is hard to imagine. Slave ships are another target for Adewale, and like the plantations, you need to be extra careful because a stray cannonball could inadvertently kill one of the people you're trying to save. However, this particular attack goes horribly wrong. After sinking one of the escorts, the other escort turns round and opens fire on the slave ship. Better 100 dead slaves than 100 free slaves, that's just good business. Trying to save people from the sinking ship is one of the most horrific and heartbreaking scenes in the entire Assassin's Creed franchise. The sense of helplessness is overwhelming, the horror of being chained up, unable to escape while the ship plunges into the ocean, and the truth that even with all his skill and strength, there's just not enough time for Ade to save all or even most of the people trapped on board. There are no words that can comfort such a tragedy, just a pure, impotent rage against a world where things like this are allowed to happen. The final hit comes when you confront the governor himself, and he doesn't gloat, he doesn't apologise. In fact, he doesn't even understand why Adewale is so upset.
Why? I have killed many men on principle, but never have I wanted one to suffer as much as you. To understand what it is to gasp and beg for your life, like the innocents you drowned.
You mean those slaves? That ship? But they're not even human. Without the discipline and guidance of their masters, they turn to rebellion. Murder. Like you.
I only wish that were true.
Defiant isn't a supervillain, he isn't even a Templar. In fact, the Templars in this game oppose slavery, which is a bit rich considering their overall master plan, but whatever. Defiant is just a man who committed an atrocity without even realising what he was doing because he can't even view slaves as real humans. And that is so much more horrific than any kind of big villainous monologue ever could be. This is how a system as cruel as slavery was able to become so commonplace, because the people perpetuating it were so deluded that they couldn't even conceive of what they were doing as cruelty. You couldn't ever convince a man like that he's wrong. A man who can see human beings with a different skin colour as closer to animals is not a reasonable man. And the world Adewale lives in is ruled by these men. There is no satisfaction to be found in killing a man like that and making him suffer, because nothing could ever make up for the damage he's already done in his willful ignorance. All you can do is cry out for freedom, bury your heart, accept the consequences of the fight, and fight anyway, because as long as men like Defiant rule, the atrocities will just continue. And again, I'll try not to read too much into Ubisoft making the villain of the DLC an old Frenchman ignorant of his own atrocities. Freedom Cry is one of the few stories in the series with no modern-day aspect, no First Civilization ancient magic, not even any Templar conspiracies, and it's all the better for it because these things would just complicate the story that Freedom Cry is telling. Despite having the same building blocks as Black Flag, Freedom Cry couldn't be more tonally different from the base game if it tried. It's dark and depressing and the complete opposite of safe, and I'm glad for that. I think it's all the stronger for it. But a small part of me still wishes that Freedom Cry was the whole of Black Flag instead of just a little bonus, because Freedom Cry evokes more thought and emotion in 5 hours than Black Flag does in 30. but it would be a massive risk, maybe even bigger than Assassin's Creed 3. Adewale looks like the cliché of a big scary black man, and he's a criminal to boot. It's a story where the only white characters are the villains, because as we saw back in the base game, even the white heroes are ambivalent on the issue. Safer then to quarantine it off into a DLC pack that most people will never play. It's things like this that serve as a reminder that racism is not just a thing from the history books as some people like to pretend it is. If it was, then Edward Kenway wouldn't still be considered the default of what a protagonist is, from which all other types of person are a deviation. Adewale wouldn't be considered too risky to make the star of your big budget game for not meeting that default standard. Ubisoft aren't being racist themselves, the people want Edward Kenway. That's not racism, that's just good business. Uh-oh, I think we strayed off the path there and started having a genuine conversation. That's not the sort of conversation that Ubisoft likes us having, especially not when we're about to enter the whitest era of Assassin's Creed. Turns out playing it safe worked pretty well for Black Flag, so of the two options presented to them, they chose the Kenway path. That's not bad, it's just status quo, it's the absence of taking any action. I already opened this with the confession that Black Flag is one of my favourite games in the series, so I hope it's clear that my problem isn't with anything in the game itself, which is all executed perfectly fine, but rather with the thoughts that went into the making of the game behind the scenes. The rumour for a while now has been that Black Flag is getting a remake, not just a remaster, but a full-on remake, and that's odd. I mean, it makes sense financially because it's a fan favourite, but it's not really a game that needs a remake. The visuals are maybe starting to show their age a bit, but what really needs a remake is Freedom Cry. Yes, I am ending this critique in exactly the same way as the Liberation critique for exactly the same reasons. We don't need remakes of games that are already good, we need remakes of games that have potential and could be made better. And they could come out right now and say that the remake of Black Flag will retell the story from Adewale or Mary Reed's perspective, and I would be so on board. But they're not going to do that. And that'll be fine. I like Black Flag, I like Edward just fine, but I'll always be wishing for something more.
And all the harm that I've done, alas, it was to none but me. And all I've done for want of a wit to memory now I count. So that parting glass, good night and joy be with you all.
Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons for your continued support. If you'd like to see your name up here, or just support the things that I do, then please consider signing up, as well as a like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring the bell because a Man of War is on the horizon. Also, it'll give you notifications. For my entire Assassin's Creed series critique, you can click up here. We're, I think, at the halfway mark now, so, that's great. It only gets longer from here. Or for another game that came out in 2013 and is just as impactful and influential and is also making a surprise comeback, here's a video about Flappy Bird.